Hello, everybody. Welcome. Wonderful to be together again. Even if the together has an unusual structure, in that we are not physically together. And obviously, I must be doing something very strange at this moment because, at the very least, one moment. At the very least, something unusual is going on in terms of my behavior. Interestingly, if we look at the idea of art, any form which is not live, i.e. a symphony or dance or theater production, an oration, a performance of some kind. Any of the kinds of art that aren't live, and many of those which are, comprise something that in English we would call a recording. And I would suggest that the word recording is related very closely to the word religion, right? Which that ligny, the ligny phoneme or the ligny word part. What is that called? I can't recall at the moment. Indicates like ligaments. To bind across, it's very important, not just to bind together, to bind together across a gap. This is the important feature of the ligny asset, which figures in the word religion and is essentially translated in the word recording. So, recording, I'm suggesting that the word fragment chord plays the same role, or a very similar one, as the LIG fragment in religion. And when we are recording, if I am painting, if I am drawing, if I am writing, my primary purpose is probably quite complex and may not necessarily involve the concept of pleasing or impressing somehow or transforming future others in the future. And it would occur to nearly none of us, yet I do think it's entirely reasonable to imagine this, that we might affect others in the past. Turns out that there's a number of possibility spaces in which this isn't merely possible, it seems relatively obvious to be real. In other words, to be the case that these things happen, they occur, we can enact them. We can affect previous others. At least if previous others are anything like our imaginings about previous others at all, we can certainly affect them. But the weird thing that I was doing here is I am pretending that you and I are together in the future, so that my voice will literally, in the terms of Milton Erickson's hypnotic suggestion that is very rich, my voice will go with you. I will go with you into the future. So, to create this recording that acts, in a sense, as a kind of ligament crossing a temporal gap, a spatial gap, a purposive gap, right? In that, for this to happen, for me to make this and you to hear it, we must form and enact a shared purpose. And it doesn't have to be exactly the same purpose, right? In fact, I have so many purposes in creating these recordings, so many different dimensions of purposive concern, that it would be kind of ridiculous for me to say, oh, I'm doing this because X, right? Because I want to preserve my thoughts for future generations, or because I want to keep my mind and vocabulary sharp and embody and improve my skills with oration, and perhaps rhetoric, and, yes, those little pieces both of those are ingredients in the soup, but the soup is much richer than that. So, what got me making this recording this afternoon was I was listening to an interview, I think, with Ralph Metzger. I may be mispronouncing his name. And it was an interview about, there's always a title of an interview that's supposed to say something about what it's about, but then there's the actual interview, which clearly is usually different, much like the title of a movie. It's the way the book inflects the title we read on its cover. It's the way the movie inflects the the few words of a phrase that are its title, that determines whether genius was at play, or people are just putting jigsaw puzzles together algorithmically. And in the interview with Ralph, it was clear that some of the concerns were the nature of consciousness, the possibility space of consciousness, particularly as compared to what we might ordinarily think or imagine. The transformation of the experience of the possibility space under the influence of mushrooms, for example, hallucinogens, or perhaps meditation. And the possibility that artificial intelligence, along with our rather reasonable fears and concerns and so forth, there's a danger few of us are not thinking much about. He mentioned the phrase information toxicity, and it's and the person who coined it, who's Nick Bostrom, maybe? But that refers to information that's fundamentally dangerous to humans. But then he talked about suffering and the imperative to reduce it. Like, to understand the possibility space of consciousness itself, if we could do that, then we could also understand the possibility space of suffering and find ways to turn the volume down for all beings, not just for humans. And he told an interesting story, Metzinger did. He was the first conference he ever attended in the 80s was in Europe, and it was sort of a branding discussion that the US was, here on the graph, China was here on the graph, both of them ahead of Europe. And the European idea was, we'll give you ethical AI, right? No one will be spied on. We're going to try to draft a guideline for the ethical implementation of AI. And what Metzinger quickly discovered was that this was an absolute facade. The people involved were all the scions of big industry and trying to figure out how to capture market share, and their actual motivations had nothing to do with being ethical. What they had to do with was, as usual, selling a product. Now you can see that this kind of a situation is an actual religion. It is truly a false religion. It doesn't worship a God. It doesn't worship relationships. It worships money, power, the possibility of reproduction and branching, mutation. It worships corporation, right? Which you can hear in the core CORP fragment. You hear to come together, right? Esprit de corps, CORPS, I think in French. And then you have the O, which is sort of like an omatic word, like corpomatic. It automates and announces not humans, but a process in this case. A set of processes that function together to form something that competes against gods, against religion, against biology itself, against science, against intelligence, against survival, right? But it does so under the false flag of some unique form of virtue or convenience. In so doing, it attempts to create cohorts of users, fans, customers, customers. So it also competes against traditions and replaces them with economic demons, essentially. Right? Economic tumors. All of this would be very surprising if we lived on a world without it and then we suddenly saw our planet. Right? We would be shocked silly, like that. That's not supposed to be even a possible thing that could happen. How could it have actually taken place on this world? And the story of how it actually took place is a dumpster fire of science fiction starters, right? Little seeds of dystopian and utopian science fiction stories. It turns out that we have this property when we are broken out of small, intimate groups, relatively intimate cohorts, little tribes and things. When we are broken out of those, when our direct connection to living places, the foods of our place on the world, the climate, the localization, when we are dislocated, right, on the face of the earth, in time, in relation, in identity, in role, when we are dislocated, then we become more and more monumentally susceptible to a complex array of modes of feedback, modes that produce feedback in the network of human minds and their societies, which I would call our cognitium. Our cognitium is very vulnerable, and the disease spreads like fire. It's contagious as hell. There's almost nothing to oppose it. There are remedies, but they cannot usually compete with the momentum of the contagions that are now dominant. They actually can compete. In fact, a single experiment could take down the entire system of malignant pretense that is most of what's going on as our social and economic systems. We could take that down in probably 90 days, especially if we had not just one really interesting and momentous experiment that could draw wide participation, but 5 or 6 that could synergize. You could take down the entire alien cortex in one man's words, right? That thing is vulnerable. It's resting on a very small number of accessibly manipulable pivots, and it's catastrophically top-heavy. If you can just touch one of those pivots in the right way, the whole thing will fall right over. Whether or not we'll live long enough to attempt such experiments, presuming that we don't start one right now, or that even our discussion here is not the beginning of one, which it could be, or become. Human culture, purposive orientations, and intelligence is absolutely a manipulable quantity or domain. There are thousands of experiments at manipulating it per minute, per second probably, in social media, in algorithms, in advertising, in pornography, in politics, in religion. in language, in art. I'm going to circle all the way back to what got me to hit the record button today. I was listening to Ralph Metzger in this interview, and he mentioned Aldous Huxley having in his book The Doors of Perception, which I have read at least once. He mentions that clearly Huxley was approaching the verge of sheer panic, and said, apparently kind of to himself, oh, it mustn't become this. This is much too far for this to have been going. This has gone too far. If it's going to go this far, this is too far for anything to go. Right? And there is, right, this point at the verge of what I often describe as non-ordinary experience, and which one of my friends, Jesse, yesterday was arguing is actually just ordinary experience, like there isn't any second thing. And this was... She has a powerful argument. I argued that we maintain both distinctions, right? That we see everything as a unity first, but we also have the ability to distinguish. But at the verge of... there's a sort of liminal twilight space where we suddenly find ourselves, we unexpectedly, perhaps, almost always, find ourselves experiencing a perspective or a situation that we are unprepared for, that doesn't match up very well with our common expectations and rational explanations and categories for identity and sequence and meaning, and is effectively either at the edge or outside the possibility, the ordinary possibility space of consciousness that we experience every day and are familiar with, and thus feel comfortable navigating. Consider that if you're in a space you're not familiar with, you actually can't tell what will kill you. Right? So if it goes dark, it doesn't have to go that direction. But if it goes dark and you're in a situation where there's something happening that you don't know what it is, or that it violates the entire history of your thought about everyday reality, what we usually refer to as normative, one of the also very dangerous ideas that there's a norm, because really the inaction spaces of biological, cognitive, and perhaps metaphysical relation are so vast, and our expectations and understanding of them are so narrow that it's like you've got a pin cushion 300 miles in diameter covered with pins, and you're going to pull 3 of them up to pay attention to. This is what's normally going on, right? The normative consciousness. We think we know what everything is. If something shows up that draws that deeply into question, or immediately into question, we are likely to experience terror. Not necessarily. This happens to children all the time and they don't flip out. It often happens to adults and they don't go nuts with terror. But you can see how there is an actual problem, because if your fundamental assertions about the nature of reality, identity, separation, what makes two things distinct, the difference between cooperation and competition, the existence or non-existence of predators, traps, threats, right? If all the things you use to arm your threat sentinel, if the foundations of those perspectives and concerns are suddenly invalidated, you can't tell what could kill you now. You're not sure what a threat is anymore. And you can't tell whether what you did in the past was any good. Right? It could have been monumentally ignorant because you were only seeing 3 of the pins instead of 97 of them transforming in a manifold over, set moment to moment in consciousness. Which is probably what a lot of biological, non-hyper-representational cognitive animals are doing. So there's this problem with insight, and the problem is actual insight can be terrifying because it can feel like you're going to die. It can't go this far, right? This is way too far for it to go. And clearly, in some cases, it's going to go much, much further than that, right? Especially with psychedelics, right? The initial onset of, hey, this is a little too much, turns into, oh my, what is that? What the hell is happening to my mind, right? The trees are dancing in a rhythm that looks like letters flowing through language, and they're saying something to me in a language I understand, but isn't English, and I can't hold it in consciousness long enough to articulate it to you. And this kind of crazy, like the world can turn into something that resembles a series of metaphysical cartoons. Or, figurations of otherwise unimaginably profound meaning. And what I think should be obvious to us is that the actual possibility space for our consciousness, it's like the difference between the universe and Poughkeepsie, or even a restroom in a cafe in Poughkeepsie, right? This is the difference, right, between what we are usually doing and experiencing in consciousness with our minds and what is actually accessible to us. And there are forms of cognition accessible to us that literally could outperform the entire history of human science in an hour. There are forms available to us that would certainly result in coherent 9-way communication with anciently evolved non-human intelligences that are native to time-space. Right? They're probably in, if particles exist, they're in the particles. What is going on? Okay, I see. Right, that a little bit of that was just happening to me. I saw something, I'm like, wait a minute, what is happening there? But when this starts to happen, not so much in the world, though if it happens in the world, that can be really destabilizing. And honestly, I remember, I've told this story before, but it had such a huge influence on me. I was bringing something back to a friend's house at night after we hung out and played pool, his guitar, and I had permission to enter his house at will, right? we're friends. It's not a problem. But so I went through his back gate, and I walked into his open garage, this little side door, and I was walking toward the door that leads into the living area and kitchen to hang the guitar in its wall hanger, and he came out that door, and he certainly wasn't expecting anything to be there. He wasn't certainly expecting anything alive to be there. He definitely wasn't expecting a human to just be standing on the other side of that door. So he went through very quickly, over the course of like probably something resembling 2 seconds. I saw him, and of course I could only understand this in hindsight, but I saw him going through the phases, right? And the first one was very clearly, I'm going to take this out, right? It was the masculine, house-protecting, that thing's not supposed to be there, it's about to die right now, right? First there was startlement, and then immediately after startlement, the kill switch, right? That thing's going down. But then confusion, and then recalibration, and probably the fact that I was holding a guitar in my hand. Just letting the guitar hang there from just below the headstock, right? Not held like a weapon, just hanging in my hand. And it's kind of high because I don't want to smack it on anything, so I'm holding it up. And there was just this moment where I saw him go through the phase shifts of what is happening. This isn't supposed to be happening. This isn't normative. And it ended, of course, with him powering down the adrenaline system, not attacking me, thankfully, because he would have ruined me. And recognizing like what has actually occurred. In other words, filling in the interval between the last time he saw me and this time that he is seeing me with coherent information that structured that interval, producing a non-threatening interpretation of the moment. Now, some people, when unexpectedly faced with staggering novelty, especially intelligent novelty, some of those people are going to go nuts. Because there's all kinds of problems, but one of the problems is, if this is true, if what I'm seeing right now is real, then everything I ever thought was wrong, because there's nothing I ever thought that could have allowed for something like this. And if everything I ever thought was wrong, probably every decision I ever made was wrong. And there's an aspect of consciousness that sort of watches over the timeline in memory, checking for bad mistakes, stuff we should be ashamed of, stuff we should be embarrassed about, stuff we were chagrined about, stuff we regret. There's an aspect of consciousness that basically, probably more than one, right? There's a suite of assets that watch over such matters. And if those get triggered, suddenly, with a gigantic, unexpected influx of stuff they have to process, namely everything we've ever done, very few people will manage to negotiate that wave front without either shutting down or fleeing or explaining away what's going on. Oh, I'm just hallucinating. No big deal. You know? I guess that's kind of intimate, hearing me drink water. Sound is very organismal. So, even myself, okay, there's a degree, there's literally a degree, and I'm thinking about something funny, but it's almost like there's a membrane boundary beyond which things should not proceed. Just as Huxley was intimating, even though I mangled his quote. Essentially, it should not have gone this far, and it must go no further. Right? And obviously what he's talking about is the radical and effectively unavoidable, right? You can't just turn it down. Transformation of his waking consciousness under the influence probably of mescaline. Even myself, though, there's a boundary where if a relatively ordinary, I remember one time I was praying to the sun. It was afternoon. And I was very sincerely praying. I was almost crying. I was very upset. Because I felt that the spirit of the sun had abandoned me. So I was calling out to the sun in my heart. And I could see it. I was on my back porch. And in a way, I'm having kind of an experience at the moment. So I was praying to the sun, and suddenly it was as if I was having a vision in the special place in my mind where insight and visionary experience happen. And I think of it as a place, even though clearly it's not a place, but I could locate it where I think it is physically. I just don't think it's physical, right? These are all, what are they? What is the word? These are, the word will come to me. These are common, prosaic, right? This is the prosaic ideas that I do have. Okay? I just don't trust them. So I had this vision. The sun seemed to be showing me what it's up to. Like one of the things it does that's very important around here that the humans don't know about. Well, that was a strange emphasis. And the sun seemed to be showing me that it was manipulating a complex manifold in a crucial way that structured and supported the
No, the other thing.
I get it. It's Sunday. That's the motorcyclist procession that you hear in the background. I guess I'm going to let it go on and not mute the mic, so bear with me. The sun showed me this impossible, a thing you could never imagine if you spent your life trying. And it showed me features of it, why they were important, and what their results were in the solar system and on our world. And to say my mind was blown would be a wild understatement. This was like nothing I imagined to be possible. Although one thinks that if a man begins to pray to the sun, then surely he will not be too surprised if the sun actually answers. But since that is almost never part of my normative experience, and my regular everyday consciousness certainly doesn't believe in that. The aspect of my mind that believes in that is very different from my waking rational mind. And the rational mind is extremely threatened by the existence of such an other mind. Mine is. And someone, a therapist listening to me, or a psychologist might be thinking hilarious thoughts here like, oh, good luck in this guy maintaining anything resembling a coherent psyche, or
oh, you are on one.
He's just going to continue to undergo various forms of schizogenesis. But it's not entirely true. There is sort of a truce between the two kinds of mind, or the two aspects, and maybe each aspect has many sub-aspects. But what happened immediately was my rational mind said, no, absolutely not. No. We're not doing that. We are not going there. Like, what was Churchill's quote? It was something like, perhaps you know what it is. Up with this we will not put. Right? Yeah, that's my waking mind. Fiercely, if I'd been riding a horse, it would have dug its front, we'd have been at a gallop, we'd have been flying along, it would dig its front paws, its front hooves into the earth, lower its head, buck its ass, and catapult me into free space. Just, no, I'm not going there. Totally put the brakes on. And it might be useful. We might need both kinds of cognition, but they can certainly play together better, more cooperatively. And what ended up happening was, when I handed the vision off to the linguistic aspect of my rational mind and said, here, what I need from you is to help me understand how I could explain this or talk about this to other humans using language. Once it realized there was a role for its kind of skill and its some of its finest articulations, right? Once it understood, like, oh, I'm not being excluded, I have a very important role here, this isn't going to just take over consciousness so that I get evicted, then that aspect calmed down and was perfectly happy with its new job, which was to find some way to talk about the vision. And that's something it was used to because it had practiced it for a long time during a 9-month phase of my life. That wasn't my first embryogenesis, though maybe it was doing it then too, I don't know. But yeah, it responds with terror sometimes, but not always. There are people who, under the influence of sudden, inexplicable, catastrophic novelty, such as arises during lucid dreaming, or perhaps the use of some psychedelics, the hopefully intelligent use of some psychedelics, the occasionally intelligent use. Wow. So there are some people who naturally submit, right? They just immediately surrender to the situation. And that's almost the explicit opposite of forming up against it. There's a fallen tree. It is evening. The reflection of the branches of the tree forms a second tree in the reflection on the water, seemingly on the water's surface, but it has depth. It is dim, but not dark, and the waves are making the lower tree, the reflection tree's branches, wave and pulse. And that is an effect that must, for tens of thousands of years, have been familiar to our ancestors as a portal. Portal to what? Well, a portal beyond your regular waking world consciousness and into a variety of things, including other states. Not states, other modes, yeah. And multi-modes of consciousness, awareness, purposeful potential, the possibility space of human consciousness. So some people naturally relax into the sudden onset of extreme novelty. Obviously, it seems very likely that death, whatever experience we may have or not have at death, and let's be clear, this must probably resemble the very broad array of experiences that we have falling asleep. Right? Whole library of different kinds of experiences. We may call them all dreams, they're not. That's like saying, it's like saying the word things to refer to objects that can be discerned by the mind, right? The fact that you have one, oh, there it is. There it is. There's what I was looking for. Oh, and it's not what I thought it was. Okay. Huh. So I thought I saw a kingfisher the other day. It looked a lot like one, but it's actually a wood duck. Now, you can look at what just happened there, okay? Experienced phenomena. Other day, saw a bird, blurry, moving fast. I thought, it looks like a kingfisher. And kingfishers are rare, so I was hoping to see a kingfisher. First of all, the word kingfisher tells me nothing about the bird at all, except maybe it eats fish, okay? Doesn't help me understand any of the features of the bird. And a language like this makes us dumber every time we use it, because the language should have some links at least connotations that give us information about who the bird relates with, what it does, its sounds, its mating month, which moons it's active in, which ways in, all these things. But something that just says, blop, that's a blop. That's going to make us dumber every time. And admittedly, the word kingfisher has some connotations. Very important: royalty, kingship, powerful, divinely mandated, or, blessed, right? And then fisher, which has lots of connotations besides just catches fish. Fisher king in Christian-esque literature and so forth. So it has a few. Wood duck has almost none. Some of the words in English still have something left in them. It's not just blop, but it's not much compared to older languages. I mean, older languages had the opposite problem. Swarming connotation webs would come to mind in a language where each letter has a spelling, each letter has 6 different numbers associated with it under different conditions, and so forth. But yes, the sudden onset of novelty often casts us into a crisis. That crisis tends to resolve in one of 3 ways. What would these 3 ways be? Let's see. Well, imagine what they might be. I'll give you a few moments. Try to imagine what usually happens to human minds when they're suddenly faced with monumental novelty. See if you can come up with 3 distinct responses. There's probably 7 or 15 or 1,000 or something, but we'll just go for 3. So, one is relatively well known to older audiences, 30s, 40s, 50s. Very common for young women when they actually see the human males that comprised the rock band The Beatles. They would apparently undergo such a radical and sudden cascade of internal stimulation and thus feedback in their nervous systems that they would lose consciousness, right? And just fall over unconscious, right? Fall down to the ground. And sometimes en masse. Wow. A male is approaching, a giant male heron is approaching his nest. I wonder if he'll dance. I wonder if he'll signal to other herons that can see him. No, he seems to be relaxing. Wait. See? Uh-oh. Oh, there's a little bit of dance there. Extending the neck high with the neck feathers spiked out. And then a shake, and then a call. And then relaxing. I'll tell you a secret about the geese
Please.
that even the ornithologists don't know, and they wouldn't believe it.
Please.
You can tell which one of those is male and female visually, the same way the geese do, but there's nothing in the literature about this. You see the way that the white sticks up on the butt of the front one? That's the male. And you see how the other one is relatively level? Yeah, that's the female. And I once tried to explain that to an ornithologist, and he got very upset. He's like, there's no literature about this. There's nothing. Yeah. My pleasure. I got a bit distracted by the lake and the heron. I once saw his dance, and I knew in the non-rational aspect of my mind, I knew, this in a sense is this is a magical thing. This is not necessarily supernatural, but qualifies for the connotation web of that word. It is powerful, and not in the way that rational things or mechanics are powerful. And I learned a little bit of how to emulate parts of that dance by watching that one time, the only time I've seen it. So, okay, sudden onset of novelty. What happens? Unconsciousness, fear, right? Which, let's face it, very metabolically expensive. Not likely to resolve the situation because it will produce feedback around the features that are most troubling in awareness, right? It'll produce a feedback effect in awareness where I begin by reacting to a phenomena, but very shortly thereafter, I'm actually reacting to my own reactions to phenomena. Right? And now I'm in bad trouble. Because now it almost doesn't even matter if the phenomena goes away. I'll keep reacting to the reaction, to the reaction, to the reaction for some time, right? For some interval of time. So terror / anger, right? Like fright, flight, fawn, freeze. Now it turns out that the fawn response tends to lead to fawning tends to lead to surrender. Fright, flight, freeze tends to lead to further self-stimulation. One might imagine that the unconsciousness of the girls who saw the Beatles guys, and I mean, women have fainted for all kinds of reasons. My mother once fainted in a grocery store in the afternoon, probably a blood pressure problem. At least, this is what my mechanical thought imagines. So then, of course, the third option is fascination, co-emergence with the experience, right? The self becomes actively emergent. It co-emerges with the experience. It neither forcefully differentiates nor merges. There is an elision, eliding, sort of quality, as if the experience and what is emerging co-conduct each other, right? In the sense of how a symphony may sometimes relate with a conductor when they are both skillful and they are really doing what they appear to be doing. Honestly, I'm sure conductors are going to be really mad at me for saying this, but I had a close friend who was a conductor when I was in my early 20s. His name was Granville. And I always thought it was never obvious to me that conductors were doing anything that was actually necessary to cause an orchestra to become coherent. Right? A quartet can do it. The conductor the idea of the conductor seems a typically Western, monarchic, hang on. Monarchic, hierarchic, masculocentric. I mean, I could go on. It just seems egregiously unnecessary. Now, conducting is one of the aspects of the creation of music that I have not studied. So I don't know what is actually going on there. I do know that it's relatively difficult to learn and requires something resembling the skill of the pianist, where you must do two different things with each of your hands and arms. You have to be able to have one rhythm with your left hand and a distinct rhythm with your right. Though it is not always the case during the enaction of conducting behavior that this is happening. It just has to be able to, you have to be able to do it because it will be required. This is one thing I think. And I'm still not sure that conducting is necessary for symphonies. I very much suspect that the symphony could have a team of leads. The leads could work together to signal somehow, if signaling is even required. Oh wow, there's another blue heron doing its circaviation of the nest. They're so huge, their wingspan. Well, I guess that's only true compared to most of the birds we see. See, that's the weird thing about comparative consciousness, right? It compares, but it uses standards as its comparators. Now, if we were to suddenly intentionally change those standards, oh shit, here come the motorcycles again. Dang. If we were to suddenly change those standards, all of our derivations would be different, right? If the standard for gigantic is 19 feet of physical wingspan, then most of the birds are microscopic and the herons are, modestly unsmall or something, right? So yeah, the comparators we select, this is why humans often, especially in language, they will say, well, you know, most people, X, Y, Z, things they think are true of most people. But they have never examined most people. What they're actually talking about is how they think about most people and how most people are inclined to think about most people and what they've heard most people saying about most people and so forth. The worst common denominator problem. You know, the actual novelty of what is happening in my own body over 1 second of time is probably staggering enough that if 100,000th or 1,000,000th of it were suddenly available to my conscious awareness, I would fall unconscious. It would overwhelm, it would blow the breakers, right? It'd blow the breakers. Or if I could learn to maintain consciousness under the influence of like 1,000,000th of that actual physical manifold of novelties and impossibly ancient relationships, then I'd probably become capable of siddhis, right? Superhuman. Categorically superhuman behaviors, senses, abilities, so forth. And this is part of what I argue that we should and must explore together. We must retrieve together the possibilities of our humanity that have long been occluded by language, culture, thrisps, corporations, war machines, propaganda, quote, civilization, unquote. But even I, when faced with novelty, happened to me a couple times recently where I found myself in the presence of a physical phenomena, a small one, that I could not immediately categorize, or I couldn't immediately completely categorize. So in both of these cases,
I want to like lightly study like March.
So I could tell in both cases that what I was probably looking at was an insect. In the first case, the behavior of the insect was so novel that I had the beginning of that feeling Huxley described. I am fascinated by insects. I've spent good chunks of my life in amateur study of them. I adore them. I pay attention to them. I notice them. So the first situation was an insect behaving in such a way that I could not understand A, what kind of an insect it might possibly be, and B, what the hell it was doing, and C, it also had the aura that the dancing male crane had. Ah, this is magic. This is powerful. This is supernatural. This is non-ordinary. Who is it? In his little book on language, I think, might be called Language and Myth, Ernst Cassirer talks about the creation in an African culture of what he refers to as a tro, T-R-O. And I'm not sure where he's getting his data from here. It sounded like he actually went in person to talk with the people of the tribe he was speaking of. But essentially it's something he would call a momentary God. And this is anything that left a profound impression on someone. Probably almost always in that culture a male. But like, let's say you're extremely thirsty, you're dying of dehydration, and an animal leads you to a place to dig and you find water there. It is a tro. Or there's a series of shocking events that take place, and it seems to you that it is because of this tree right here, right, that these things take place. This is what I felt. I felt terror for a moment, a very brief moment, when I saw the insect doing what I had never seen an insect do. My rational mind went into, what the fuck is going on? What is that? That can't be true. That can't be right. I've never seen that. This is taking things too far. This is too far to take things. For a moment. Now what it was doing was half hovering in a sort of what is the word? Half hovering in the pattern of a lemniscate pattern, a figure eight, except with teardrop sides rather than circles. It was slightly hovering and moving over the carpet in the hallway under a lamp in this pattern. And over time it calmed down. I got a jar. I put the jar over it. I put paper under the jar. And when it completely calmed down, it was clear that it was some form of a cricket. And I believe that I rationally now know what was happening, which was that the presence of the light and in the nighttime triggered it in a way similar to how the full moon might otherwise trigger it, to spread pheromones and attract mating companions. Now, do I think that, quote, is what was happening, unquote? No. In representational cognition, in the aspect of mind that thinks about cause and effect and mechanics and so forth, yes, in that layer, not a bad probable description of what was happening, even though I don't actually know what the creature was doing. And at first I couldn't tell that it wasn't injured, right? It wasn't clear that it wasn't a flying creature that was failing to fly. So as I continued to observe it, I went through the phases similar to what my friend went through. I was extremely puzzled, but the fear wore off pretty quick because the scope was narrow enough that it probably wasn't going to threaten everything I'd ever known, right? And it wasn't going to invalidate all the decisions and categorical derivations I'd ever made. It had a limited scope, I realized fairly quickly. I could categorize it. It was an insect. But at first, I did feel fear because I couldn't figure out what my own role was. When I encounter something that I don't know what it is, this calls my own identity into question because we enact identity together. We become who we can become together whether we think so or not, most of the time. And so experience draws, like there's a rhythmically negotiated arisal of identity in circumstance, right? Joe thinks he's Joe. He just got home from work. He takes a shower, makes some tea, reads a book. He's listening to Bach. He's very calm. He knows who he is. Suddenly, guys in battle armor with AK-47s bust through his roof, come down on strings and point guns at him. Is Joe the same Joe that he was a moment ago? Absolutely not, right? Like, context calls us into role behavior. And if we change the perspective of context, if we change our orientations within context, which we certainly have the volitional ability to do, then we become different kinds of beings and different versions or modes of our possible selves. So part of the problem, the fear of sudden, the onset of extreme, unexpected novelty, is that it not only causes us to question, if it's broad enough, right, all historical derivations and activity, it shatters our own sense of coherent identity for ourselves. And maybe this is part of what is meant by when I say the phrase, it is powerful, right? Which I mean in a ceremonial sense, not in a representational sense. I don't mean it's like PG&E. And yet that connotation isn't bad, because the association with electricity, thunder, lightning is very strong, right? It is powerful. So yeah, what happens when we suddenly encounter unexpected novelty? Now obviously, one of the things that will almost always happen this often happens anyway, in lucid dreaming experiences, is that as the mode of awareness begins to shift toward lucidity, there's a pretty good chance right at that boundary that the manifold will collapse and we will wake up. But we can learn by practicing, presuming that we can practice our way to awareness in the dream state, which certainly, if anything is a spiritual practice, this thing is, or is one of them. If we can practice our way to awareness in the dream state, we can learn how to sort of turn down the volume on how to kind of slide into the manifold sideways rather than directly penetrating it from above. And by the way, similar things are the difference between a planet that gets snuffed by an asteroid and one that doesn't. Like angle of approach turns out to matter a lot in all kinds of human and biological situations. But yes, so if we learn how to, we can learn how to sustain awareness in such a way that it doesn't cause the bubble to pop, so to speak, then lucidity will arise. And in that situation, what we will almost certainly experience is an upsurge in novelty, a transformation of color, senses, relational feelings, depth in the dreaming experience. For some people it becomes ultra vivid. For others there are oral transformations, right? There are sounds. In one dream I had recently where I was on the verge of it, I could taste flavors, which is pretty uncommon for me in dreaming experience. But yeah, that's a place where we can experiment with relating with novelty in consciousness, right? Dreaming is really profound in that it's basically I wouldn't say that what we can learn and explore in dreaming is without consequence, because it's not. But it's very different from a situation in which there are physical, relational, and economic consequences, perhaps spiritual consequences, metaphysical consequences in some cases, depending on what we mean by the word. The way that the waking world seems to be. Now, you can play the waking world as if the consequences are not trenchant. And there are some forms of play in which you can do this with relative safety, a degree of safety. But ordinary physical existence is fairly fraught with danger, what we call danger. Someone who has transcended the foundations of fear is likely to appear, extremely courageous. But it's not really that it's not so much that they possess the quality of courage as it is they no longer enact the impediments that comprise fear. And that's a really important thing. Like in one of my recent videos on temperance, I talk about the difference between stuff we have to do to be good and stuff we have to not do to have the opportunity to become good. Because you kind of have to not poison the water first before you make the soup. And if you poison the water first, now you have to introduce complex antidotes before you can before you can drink the water, or others can drink the water, so to speak, metaphorically. And I think there is such a thing as courage, right? There are behaviors that are bold and courageous. They have the positive quality of being courageous. And yet, at the same time, there is something like fearlessness, which is sort of that the possibility of fear is so limited that it cannot form up, it cannot restructure consciousness. Oh my God, that owl must be huge. Well, there's that thing again, right? I'm like, wow, bigness. Big birdness. The other day, this is really ironic. So, on the very day that I think I was making a recording, it was about this time of the evening, getting dark, and someone was driving at relatively high speed backwards up one of the roads in the park here. And at first, part of me took offense and was like, what the fuck is that guy doing? Like, what the fuck is that guy thinking? Right? Or that driver. Wasn't sure of their gender. Presumed they were male. And then immediately I realized I'm probably more disoriented than that guy is, because instead of paying attention to what I'm doing or acting in a purposeful, intelligent fashion, I've decided that I'm like the local normal behavior cop, and I need to call this guy out and sort of write him a ticket in consciousness, which means I am completely defecting from my own way of life and being in the moment. Right? In effect, I have become an idiot by thinking that somebody else is an idiot or acting crazy. And an idiot in the old Greek sense of in a private universe, not connected with the beings around us. So I had this thought, and I found it hilarious to imagine that at first, that my sort of self-righteous indignation, what's this guy doing? Once again, right, you can see onset of unexpected novelty. Novelty is in this case of the category behavior of an unconnected human, right? Seemingly unconnected to me, unknown, random human. My response is policing. What the fuck is that guy doing? You know, like that's just, this person has clearly gone out of their mind. Up with this I will not put. We should not put. Yeah, right. This has gone too far. That's going too far. And you can hear this weirdly entitled, like arbiter of what is reasonable and not reasonable. Arbiter of up with what we shall put or not, right? Taking over my mind. And so I collapse, in a sense, the manifold of my possibilities collapses into this one thing. And ironically, the same night, my son called me, and he was talking about the same problem. And we had a long, hilarious conversation, because we had both noticed in our own, and in both of us it had to do with observing another driver, particularly. Someone who's driving. And we had both noticed our predilection to... It's okay. We had noticed our predilection to convert to judges and then think that there's this weird sort of self-importance that goes along with the conversion process in most of us, much of the time, where we feel that we are being somehow righteous or in the know or correct or virtuous. You know, we are enacting the protect the group instinct, protect others instinct. And so perhaps even we think we're being here, like we may have delusions of heroism and stuff like this, right? And so it was so funny to have this discussion with my son on the very same day when the same insight had occurred to me post-reaction to sudden human behavioral novelty. You know, scope is relatively limited. Again, it's not going to change everything I ever thought or did. But what happens when the structure of consciousness itself radically transforms during experiences of hypnopompia, hypnagogia, hypnosis, trance, nonordinary intrusion into, you know, the sudden emergence of nonordinary or supraordinary phenomena, stimuli, etc., into regular, everyday waking consciousness. That stuff is unprepared for that unless it has a lot of practice. Hello. You know, I am told by my friend Ryan Firstdiver that often in the sweats And I'm not necessarily claiming that this is purely metaphysical. I'll explain what I mean. But often in the sweat lodges, the men are literally terrified. Like, some of them are crying, if I remember what he said correctly. They're like losing it. They really believe they are about to die. And sometimes, some of them. And this is nothing to be ashamed of. It's not something that is frowned on, I don't think. Though some inactions of it might be. It's not necessarily probably that they think they're going to die. It's that they can't tell they'll survive, right, in a way. I mean, maybe those are two faces of the same thing. But my point is that when we're unfamiliar with the boundary between the relatively normative world in which our representational thought, evaluation, and behavior functions well enough to keep us alive and confident of our own lucidity, sobriety, then we're okay. But when we get to the boundary and we're not used to being in the boundary, especially if we're going with others, that stuff gets pretty rocky. And if we are thrust across that boundary, right, this is part of the problem with doing psychedelic drugs, is that you're not being guided to the boundary and familiarized with it and then gently led across it. Instead, it's like flipping a switch, right? Third toke of DMT, the universe disappears and is replaced by something absolutely unlike your common experience, with some degree of resemblance perhaps to extreme lucid dreaming experiences or hypnagogic or pompic experiences. Things get tricky near the boundary, but it's not usually a good idea to just push people across it. Now, on the other hand, drugs are a little weirder than we imagine. I don't know if there's anyone who drank ayahuasca and nothing happened. Meanwhile, all the other people who drank the ayahuasca have, experiences of it. But I remember when I was young, the first few times I smoked weed, and I was fully capable of smoking weed because I smoked cigarettes. So I knew what it meant to inhale smoke, and I knew what it meant to inhale the smoke and hold it, and so forth. No response to my first experiences. Probably the first 6, nothing. No effect I could discern. 7th experience, just could not stop laughing. Total collapse of consciousness into extreme hilarity, in danger of, urinating on myself. I was laughing so hard. Don't think I actually did. Uh-oh. The natives are restless because of a sports game. The monkeys are making dangerous noises and doing gorilla things and making fists and shaking them in the air and stuff. Wow, that's quite a scene. By the way, that's a lot of novelty. I think it used to take some courage for me to enter a place where people were doing something like that, because as a sensitive person, that amount of noise and yelling and stuff is intense, right?
Keep it in there for a minute. Come on, Joe.
I'm just watching the Pizza Channel. I'm just watching the Pizza Channel. Yeah, I'll come back later and get a pizza. Ah, okay, thank you. Yeah, it was my loss. It was my loss. It was one of my favorite foods.
3 years ago, he paid $17, $18 for personal pizza.
No, that's not what happened. I called. I tried to order one. They're like, $18. I'm like, $18. It was a guy. And I'm like, personal pizza? He's like, yeah, we increased the price.
There's no reason for you not to come in and talk to me.
Yeah, that's true. That's my bad. Yeah, that's my bad. But, last time when I saw you, at least I woke up. Grazie. Yeah. What is your name? Joe. I am Darren. No. Now you're acting like we're in New York. Yeah.
They were quoting you for the small one.
Yeah, of course. It's okay.
Sometimes they misunderstand with their piece.
Yeah, everybody makes mistakes. We're human.
I'm glad you're back, and I'm glad to see you.
I'm glad to see you too. I'll be back later and get a pizza. All right. Right on. You too. Thank you.
And maybe at least on top, like maybe where the HR person was, they should have been like, if you continue to like, share.
One day, I called the pizza place. They serve these little personal pizzas that are delicious, right? They're like $7, so it's cheap. And it's good. And so one day I called and I tried to order one many years ago, probably 4 years ago now. And I talked to the guy on the other end, picked up the phone, and I said, I'd like to get a personal pizza, blah, blah, what I want on it. And he tells me, $17. And I said, for a personal? He goes, yeah, the price went up. I was like, okay. So I never went back, and I never checked to see if it was wrong. I just believed that the price had doubled because lots of other prices doubled, right? Or tripled. And so for years I didn't go in. And then the other day I was talking with the same guy, Joe, the owner of Pasquale's Pizza on 8th and Irving in San Francisco. Give him a little plug there. Their pizza's good. I was talking with him outside. He said, I haven't seen you. I said, yeah. So I didn't tell him why at that time, but I went in later and just asked, how much for a personal pizza? And like $7. And I was like, wait, what? I thought, and somehow that topic is appropriate. He put cheese in my hand. That was ridiculous. Now my hand is all greasy, and I have to find a way to wipe it without spreading the grease. Thankfully, I have some napkins. And some tissues. Now, where was I? Yeah, the dreaming context is like, it's so many different things. It's very profound, the dreaming intelligences, in my view. Some neuroscientists will argue with me. But the dreaming intelligence is very profound, very ancient, very powerful, very non-ordinary, and can help us learn to experiment with not flipping out when novelty arises. And I want to be very clear that I'm not suggesting people do psychedelic drugs or even sing their praises. My bias in this matter is that we should have what I call endogenous experience of the non-ordinary, meaning without the introduction of intoxicants, particularly strong intoxicants, because those things force us across the boundary. What I was saying earlier is that, like, the first number of times that I smoked pot, I did not get high. Why was that? Later, when I was a runaway, my closest friend was an aficionado of injectable drugs, primarily coke and meth. And I tried full doses of both of those drugs. They had no effect on me. Now, one would imagine that if you inject the correct dosage of meth into a 98-pound, 14-year-old boy's arms, right? If someone's doing that to me, because that's what I'm describing here, with my, complicity, I wanted to get high, find out what this high was like. One would imagine that that's just going to have a mechanical effect. Well, 3 attempts, no effect. 2 with cocaine, no effect. Snort the drug, total effect. Inject the drug, no effect. And someone could say, like, you didn't hit the vein or whatever, but they're wrong. They're wrong about that. Thankfully, I like to think that something was protecting me from an experience that would be so compelling that I would continue chasing it. I was vulnerable to various forms of addiction, which probably started with sugar and fat, and then moved up to tobacco and weed. And weed was, in my teenage years, a drug of choice. But again, what I'm arguing is that what we want is endogenous experience, and there are lots of ways to make that happen that are easy to access. We want endogenous experience of the non-ordinary so that we are familiar with navigating the transition and so forth. And also so that we don't become confused and think, the drug is the doorway to enlightenment, or the non-ordinary experience and the drug are the same thing, right? Pause for a moment here. It's a very dangerous confusion, right? Because it's going to wrong foot consciousness in a variety of dramatic ways that are pretty difficult to come back from. Not impossible, but tough. And also, the non-ordinary experience produced by the drug. So you can imagine a kid who eats some mushrooms and goes to the mall. Or, eats some mushrooms and spends the afternoon playing a video game. Or even a little better, eats some mushrooms and spends the afternoon making music. You can imagine a young person doing this, and the difference between that and, say, an experience set up by people in a collective where Westerners come and pay to experience some kind of a ceremony, perhaps in the jungle. And the difference between that and what some indigenous tribe was doing in the jungle 8,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. These are not the same thing, right? The Western people imagine that it's the drug that is the cause of the non-ordinary experience. They're not precisely wrong. They're incompletely correct. Because it is a very complex manifold of relationships, anciently conserved relationships, that the indigenous people are reenacting, remembering, literally reconnecting. They are religneing. Hand to hand. Threat parsing something that Joe gave me some food with his hands, but that means I was willing to eat out of his hand, which was probably not a wise idea. And of course, one wouldn't like to refuse because that could be considered an insult. So I naturally accepted the food. Threat parsing that now. So yes, what's going on ceremonially? Look, there's a very complex cloud of features and potencies and memories and histories and lineages that come together in an actual indigenous ceremony in a way that is both natural, quote unquote, and extremely old, possibly, thousands or tens of thousands of years old. So that's not the kind of thing you can actually package and sell to moderns successfully. You can package it and sell something to the moderns. But unless if everybody isn't kind of all the way in. The result of that behavior will not be ceremony. It will be something else. And it will lack many dimensions of richness and depth that actual ceremony almost never lacks, right? It's almost impossible for that stuff to be missing there, mostly. As modernity progresses, less impossible, but... So, nonetheless, we are born with a broad array of faculties and abilities that only awaken that are unlikely to awaken outside of ceremony. Some people awaken them outside of ceremony. These people we think of as psychic, or we have words for them. Not necessarily intelligent words. But yes, we have words for these people. Sorcerers, witches, warlocks, mages, magi, kings, queens, princes, avatars, all these words, yeah. So I think we should learn to introduce each other gently to the non-ordinary from a position in where we go, from ordinary waking consciousness into light non-ordinary awareness, the noticing of that, the exploration of that, the deepening of that over time, right? Sort of like teaching a kid to swim. I prefer the gentle version to the stories I've heard from some young men, usually men, where their possibly drunken redneck father threw them off a bridge or something. When they were 5 or whatever. Yeah, I much prefer, and this is something we do not want to do with psychedelics. We don't want to, young men can be dangerously disoriented and think, oh, it'll be really funny to watch Johnny go out of his mind if we give him LSD, and etc., or whatever, right? Yeah, in some cases, Johnny never came back. That can go wildly south. Though probably in most cases, it doesn't go too badly. It sort of depends on lots of variables, including how Johnny's consciousness ordinarily structures itself, or doesn't. But yeah, that's not a good idea, You certainly don't want young teenagers who may have predilections for various modes of unusually organized consciousness to be suddenly subjected to something that could, set up a feedback process that doesn't come to a conclusion. Lots of dangers there, including the danger of just associating ecstasy with intoxication. Why are we prone to addiction as animals and so forth? There's a variety of reasons, but the primary problem is that our ordinary experience is not engaging and does not call us into being and into meaningful roles and learning and play and discovery and adventure, it's kind of dead inside, the whole modernity thing. And so, obviously, we can learn to displace the desire for fulfilling roles and meaningful agency into intoxication, or what's the right word? Nervous habits, right? Depilation, someone pulls their hairs out. I think that smoking cigarettes is not entirely dissimilar, because it's extremely compelling. It causes a break from whatever stimuli, right? Especially these days. You used to be able to smoke while you work or eat or whatever. Nowadays, you got to go outside to smoke in most places. So it enforces a break from, and there's a sort of a very powerful feeling aspect of intimate self-relation that is similar to, like, if you were depilating some part of your body, you know, or picking at a scab. So I think it's compensatory, and what we're trying to do is sort of like, there's a desert inside us. There's this time interval that we don't know how long it will be, where there's a profound impoverishment of relation with self, the world, and other, with identity and so forth. And this leads us to a coping mechanism, right? It's not dissimilar in a way to, it sort of reminds me of the yolk of an egg, right? You've got to go through this process where you'll develop inside the egg. Of course, the yolk of the egg is probably natural and good, and whereas the tobacco is not, particularly the kinds that we use in cigarettes and so forth. So yeah, there's this sort of coping thing, which was clear to me long before, because from my own inquiries into addiction, it became very clear that it was a coping mechanism to cope primarily with lack of nourishing, rejuvenating, social and behavioral, intellectual and creative endeavors. Okay, what am I going to do about that? So I could just turn it off. I guess I will. So yeah, I don't want people to have the impression that psychedelic drugs are the, light switch to enlightenment, which they certainly aren't. I've talked to a lot of people who've done psychedelic drugs, run some of the numbers, how many of these people seem like they're enlightened or can even say anything really meaningful about their psychedelic experience or give us insight or whatever. Very few, in my experience. Not none, but few. So yeah, I'm not sure I'm all the way in on that. There's some question whether we can just And certainly we can, we can curate ceremony-like activity together. But what you can't do, I think, is invent something that's 40,000 years old. Like it turns out that the incredible antiquity, the genius loci of time and place can be honored, but they can't be invented. So there are ways to experience and pursue learning and understanding and awareness and growth and non-ordinary experience together that are relatively virtuous, right? They're good. But the ancient traditions have, like 50 features that you can't just make up, right? You can't just go like, well, if they did it this way and we do it this way, it should work because it's a machine. That's not how those things are. Right? So we should honor ancient traditions, I think, and authentically, with reverence and humility, if we are so inclined, approach the keepers of those traditions to see if we can have a role in their rejuvenation and their sustenance and their survival in human experience, where reasonably appropriate or not directly inappropriate. And we can also invent ways of structuring, entering the non-ordinary, the spiritual, the ceremonial, the ancient lineages of relationships together that is intelligent and insightful, reverent and playful and beautiful. And that is certainly what I hope for in my own life and in my relationships with others who are similarly oriented. I have traveled many branches. Thank you for those of you who stayed the course with me. I'm so grateful, as always, to share this time together. I wish you beautiful everything in your life path, your relationships, your home, your dreaming, the economic concerns, and that I fundamentally wish for beautiful adventures for you and those you love. And I look forward to learning together again sometime soon. Bye-bye for now.